Hello, and welcome to today's webinar regarding the South Africa Assessment Protocols. My name is Bridget John, and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. We are the leading global network on best practice for using impact assessment to make informed decisions. And we're offering this webinar today in conjunction with our South African affiliate, IAIA-SA. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before we jump into our webinar. We are recording the webinar and we'll make it available afterwards. There will be a brief presentation followed by a Q&A session. So if you have questions at any time during the presentation or during the question and answer session, please go ahead and type it into the question bar, the little panel in the control panel of your menu for GoToWebinar. It's on the right side of your screen. And the slides will be made available to you afterwards. There's also a handout currently there, which is the DEA notice. So our presenter today is Dee Fischer, and Dee is the Chief Director of Integrated Environmental Support at the Department of Environmental Affairs, Forestry and Fisheries. The Chief Directorate is responsible for streamlining the environmental management function within the department. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Dee to get us started.
Thank you very much, Bridget. And good afternoon to the listeners. I'm going to present on the assessment protocols, which have been prepared in terms of Section 24(5)(a) and H of the National Environmental Management Act. So I'm going to start. So I'm going to start with the background to the assessment protocols. We're going to look at the objectives. We're going to touch very briefly on the framework, the legal framework. We're going to look at the list of environmental themes that are currently in preparation, as well as the ones that are coming up. And then we're going to look at the link to the National Environmental Screening Tool. The site verification, we'll go just very briefly into site verification, the assessment itself, the assessment protocol itself, the compliance statement, and then the way forward. And then after that, we will have the question and answer sessions. So the background to the assessment protocols, the Minister of Environmental Affairs has just gazetted her intention to prescribe general requirements for undertaking an initial site verification for protocols for the assessment, and minimum reporting requirements for environmental impacts for environmental themes, which are contained in the schedule here too, and the requirements of the protocol which apply for Appendix 6 of the EIA regulations. These are out for a 30-day comment period, and the closing date is the 10th of June. So the reasons for the assessment protocols, the objectives. So the protocols are legally binding tools intended to provide guidance to environmental assessment practitioners or specialists when preparing an assessment for a specific theme. So they are in terms of undertaking the assessment so that we can get a consistent methodology, that we can prepare reports in a consistent manner, and that we can ask specific questions which support decision making. It also allows for a level of assessment based on the sensitivity of the site. So you're only providing the information that's actually required for that level of sensitivity. So impact assessments are required in areas of high sensitivity, and compliance statements, which is completely new to our environmental assessment toolbox, compliance statements in a low sensitivity. There are exceptions to that. That's birds and heritage, and we'll go through those. A protocol provides more guidance than is currently provided for in the appendices of the EIA regulations. The legal framework, Section 24(5) A and H of the National Environmental Management Act, makes provision for the Minister to make regulations laying down procedures to be followed when applying for, the issuing of, and the monitoring of compliance to environmental authorizations. It also prescribes, and for laying down procedures prescribing minimum criteria for the report content for each type of report and for each process that is contemplated in terms of the regulation to ensure consistent quality and facilitate efficient evaluation of reports. So that's not new. That has been in NEMA, and now all we're doing is we're making use of these in order to prescribe more detail on the types of reports. Regulation 10B of the EIA Regulations 2014 identifies a requirement for an applicant to comply with any protocol or minimum information requirement relevant to that application as identified by a gazette by the Minister. Regulation 16.3 of the EIA regulations, it's generally a general application requirement. So any report or document submitted as part of an application must comply with any protocol or minimum information requirement relevant to that application. So these have been in the EIA regulations for quite some time, but the Minister has never identified any protocols, and these are the first protocols that have been identified. Section 19.1 and 21.3 just go to the different reports that are required, and the reports must comply to a protocol or a minimum requirement once that protocol has been gazetted. So the themes that we've considered, they're general requirements. So the general requirements for undertaking site sensitivity verification where there's no specific theme identified. Then there are different themes. We've identified a theme for agriculture. We've identified a theme for avifauna. Biodiversity, there are two. There's one for terrestrial biodiversity and aquatic biodiversity. There's one for noise, defense, and civil aviation. So those are the ones that are currently out for consideration of the public. We are going to add a protocol for the assessment and reporting of environmental impacts on vultures by onshore wind energy facilities. We're going to add a terrestrial species protocol, aquatic species protocol, and we will add two heritage protocols, one dealing with cultural heritage and the other one dealing with paleontology. So those will be coming shortly. In terms of how the protocols link to the screening tool, you'll see in the screening tool, when you're on checking the sensitivity either of your site or your development footprint. So, for example, if you're on the agricultural theme, you would be able to show the assessment protocol. If you go to show the assessment protocol button, and what will pop up is the protocol that has been gazetted for that theme. Just in terms of the report, there's also a link between the screening tool and the protocol in terms of the report. So the report will identify under specialist assessments it will identify the assessments that will be required, and if you press on the assessment protocol, the protocol will be shown. And then just in terms of the actual protocols, what you're looking at now is the biodiversity impact on terrestrial biodiversity. So there's a general site verification. So you would have to use this for very high. You'd have to do a terrestrial biodiversity assessment, and then it tells you what should be done in that assessment. And then if you are in an area of low sensitivity, you would just need to do a compliance statement, and the protocol gives you an indication of what would be required in the compliance statement. So it's really intended to make the process much shorter if there's no requirement to do an in-depth study. So the way forward, the comments, as I've mentioned, are due on the 10th of June. Comments will be incorporated where appropriate. Comments and responses document will be prepared, and then the document will serve our working group processes, which is our processes with provincial government, in July. And after that, if the minister agrees, they will be gazetted for implementation around September or October. And then they will become legally binding procedures for from that implementation date. Thank you very much, and I'm ready to take any questions that might be requested.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dee, for running through that. So again, if you do have questions, there is a questions panel on the right side of your screen as part of the GoToWebinar menu. Please feel free to type your questions in at any time, and I will be verbally providing those to Dee so that she can answer those. So we have a question from Natalie. Why are there not graduated requirements based on sensitivity? Only very high and low sites are referred to.
There are graduated sensitivities. It would definitely depend on which protocol you're looking at. Sometimes they are only very high and low. For example, the terrestrial biodiversity is very high or low. So you're either in the area of high sensitivity or you're not. So you will either be doing an assessment or you would be doing a compliance statement. So there isn't a difference in terms of what you would be looking at an assessment if it was a medium sensitivity. You would be required to do the assessment that's identified in the protocol.
Okay, is the document on the DEA website under the Gazette notices?
It might not be, but we will do it. We will do it today, and the documents will be available for download. They are on the government Gazette. So if anybody needed to take them from they can download them from the government printer's website, or any of the Sabinet. If they've got access to Sabinet, they could download them from Sabinet as well.
Okay, a kind of multi-part question, so I'll just take these one at a time. What happens in the instance when the specialist assessment differs from the designation of very high and is found to be high or medium?
Okay, that is dealt with in the site verification. So if you go onto site, you find that the situation on site is different to what the screening tool has identified. You would need to take photographs. You would need to provide some kind of motivation for the difference in the assessment, and then you would proceed. So for example, if the screening tool said it was very high, and you went to site and you realized that in fact it was quite degraded lands, you would be able to take a photograph and then you would proceed with a compliance statement.
All right. Does a biodiversity assessment still need to be undertaken, or is only a compliance letter required? This isn't very clear.
A compliance statement is only if you're in a low area and if it's been verified as being low.
All right. What happens if the screening tool shows a designation of high or medium, and then what protocol should be followed?
In the protocols on the left-hand side, it clearly indicates where you've got very high, medium, and low, and basically the requirements there. For the terrestrial biodiversity, it's an in or an out situation, as we've mentioned with the first question. So you either are very high or you're low, and in the very high you would do an assessment, and in the low, once you've verified, you would do the compliance statement.
Who decides on the correct protocol to follow if there's a dispute, and when and how does a dispute get resolved?
The protocols are developed for very specific themes. And so if you were doing a terrestrial biodiversity, you would need to use the terrestrial biodiversity protocol. So there can't really be any discrepancy in terms of which protocol you'd be using. I think maybe the question could be if you were in an area where the screening tool said high and you feel it's low, but I think we've dealt with that in terms of the site verification. So you would need to do the verification as the first step. And then if you could motivate and prove that it's actually a low sensitivity, you would then go to the compliance statement.
What about EIA applications already in process?
There would be a in the notice, it would tell you what is the transitional arrangement, and it would not be retrospective. So it would only be for any new applications that would be submitted to the department. So it wouldn't affect anything that was already in process.
We have a comment from someone who said that they only briefly looked at the tool, but as part of the tool, there is a link to the DEA application number. Will this be the same for DMR projects? And will the DMR use this tool as well, and how?
Bridget, I'm not sure if they're now talking about the protocols or if they're talking about the screening tool. It sounds to me like they're talking about the screening tool. The screening tool doesn't require a number. It's just in the report. When you actually do the report, you would put in you would put in the number, and the Department of Minerals and Energy are using exactly the same process for environmental authorization. They're using the NEMA process. So if the question was, would a DMR use an EIA number? Yes, that's correct. They would use an EIA number.
All right, we have a couple messages from Sue George, who is weighing in from the South African affiliate, IISA. She just wanted to mention that the documents are on the National Gazette website and are on the II South African affiliate website, and they've also been circulated to II South African members. So I just wanted to share that information from Sue. Thanks, Sue. Marshall's asking, what is the definition of the EAP in this context? Is it external or so-called independent to the organization, or internal?
The protocols don't change the EIA requirements. At the moment, an independent environmental assessment practitioner must submit an application on behalf of an applicant, and that would remain the same. So protocols just provide information on the assessment that's required, but in terms of the regulations, there's no change to the regulation.
How will projects be impacted where drafts and specialist studies were completed just before the gazetted date and final documents are being prepared for submission? How will the department look at this?
I think it's the same as what we've mentioned before. Only new applications. This would only apply to new applications, not to applications already in process. So if you were doing the second phase of your document, you would continue to do them as you have done them before.
Who would do the verification of low sensitivity?
The document indicates that the first verification should be done by an environmental assessment practitioner or by a specialist. I think in certain cases, so for example, heritage, it wouldn't be possible for a general practitioner to understand what would be the case in terms of heritage. So in that case, a heritage specialist will have to assess. And that is probably in some cases, it might be in other cases as well. For example, a species protocol, which are also not out yet. But in certain situations, it wouldn't be possible for a general environmental practitioner to be able to have the expertise to know if it is actually a low sensitivity site.
Why is there a need for the specialist to vet the compliance statement for the low sensitivity during the initial assessment?
I think so a compliance statement is basically, it's a professional signing off saying that that is the situation on site, and in most cases you would need a professional who knows, who would be able to say that in terms of their professional knowledge, that is correct, that is the correct rating for the site. So you wouldn't be doing an assessment that would identify a sensitivity. You would be confirming that the sensitivity is low.
What type of impact assessment would be required if a site has both high, medium, and low sensitivity on the site?
The protocols are quite clear. If any portion of your development footprint is on an area of high sensitivity, you would have to use that rating.
Okay. Let's see, this is more of a comment than a question. The screening tool is not working well and identifies numerous protocols not applicable. So defense and civil aviation comes up on all sites tested, and thus SACAA and OEC would have to give input. I don't think the aviation authorities have the capacity for this, and were they consulted on this requirement?
Not all assessment protocol, not all assessments are required, so it would be up to the environmental practitioner to identify where it's not necessary. So for example, the screening tool would identify a low sensitivity for aviation in most areas where there aren't airports or strips, landing strips. So in that case, then you would the environmental practitioner would say that is not relevant and include that in the report. So it's not intended to, you're not intended to require aviation to discuss each application. If it's a low sensitivity, you're not really required to do anything there. Oh, and then in terms of were they consulted, yes, civil aviation was consulted on the inputs in terms of the strategic environmental assessments that have been undertaken.
Okay, it says for whether or not the proposed development will have any impact, it says for low, and whether or not the proposed development will have any impact on the biodiversity feature. You still have to appoint a SAC NASP specialist to write and sign the compliance statement. Will this not increase costs of the EIA process hugely, even for sites with little to no impact?
I think I'm not sure that you would really be able to, these are the requirements from SAMBI, but I'm not sure that a general specialist would actually be able to determine if that sensitivity is low. So remember, you're not doing an assessment. So you're not going through the expense of doing an assessment, you're just doing a compliance statement. So a compliance statement would take a professional a few hours to really do. So the costs probably would be lower than if they had to do a full assessment for every application that was submitted, which is currently the case.
Could you confirm whether the initial site verification assessments must be submitted with the application form or as a separate report, or whether it can form part of the EIA BA report?
It does form part of the EIA report. If the protocol is quite clear that it should be submitted with the reports on the site. So it forms part of the EIA process documents. So it's not needed at the application stage.
Will a comments and responses report regarding proposed regulations be produced and available to the public?
Yes, we always do comments and responses documents, and they will be on the website, the department's website, when the documents are gazetted for implementation.
Would the protocols also apply to applications to provincial environmental authorities?
Yes, the protocols apply to the EIA regulations, irrespective of if it's of who the competent authority is.
Why is a compliance statement required by a specialist? If all the protocols are listed, even if not applicable, then numerous specialists are required to issue statements.
I think it's similar to the question that was asked before. If, for example, the theme doesn't apply to your application, then the EAP would motivate that doesn't it doesn't apply to the application, so you wouldn't be submitting a compliance statement.
Has any form of a regulatory impact assessment been undertaken?
There's no need for a regulatory impact assessment to be undertaken on the protocols. If the protocols have been identified in the EIA regulations, and that would have needed to go through an impact assessment or social impact assessment process. But at the time of doing the 2014 EIA regulations, that wasn't a requirement from DPNE.
Okay, this is a pretty broad question, and you may have covered it in your slides, but what is the purpose of the screening instrument and associated assessment protocols?
Okay, so the screening tool, basically the screening tool is there to ensure that we all use the same information, that information is readily available to people, and that we use the same sensitivities. So the base information should be the same for all applications. It also means that between the applicant, the developer, and the decision maker, we all have an understanding of what the sensitivity on the site is, and then that is confirmed through the work on the protocols. So the screening tool really is there to make sure that the information base is sound and most up-to-date information is available. And the protocols are there to assist in ensuring that all of the reports, they don't contain unnecessary information, but they contain the information that is required for decision making. So that really is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a more streamlined process where we are focusing on the information that's required for decision making.
It's clear that if the findings of the initial site sensitivity verification assessment are confirmed, the EAP can proceed with the process and attach the ISVA to the project documents. What is unclear is the process to dispute the outcomes of the ISVA. Must it be subject to PPP, or can it be submitted directly to DEA? And will DEA inform the EAP as to how to proceed? And if so, how long will DEA take to provide the appropriate way forward?
I'm not sure I really understood the question totally, but let me take a stab at answering. It seems to be that what the person is asking is if there's a dispute. So the screening tool showed a very high sensitivity, but in fact the EAP goes out to site and sees that the area has been quite degraded and it's not as it was previously. I think it's the same answer really that we've given before, which is then just to say that the EAP would then take photographs and do the necessary put necessary evidence together. So for example, photographs or satellite imagery using Google Earth or whatever, just to show that actually the situation is not the same as was identified on the screening tool. And then they would proceed to move towards a compliance statement rather than assessment. So there's no requirements for approvals. They of course need to be sure that anybody would have the same finding, but surely if you have the evidence, that should be okay.
A two-parter here. I'll just ask the first part first. How will the tool and protocols improve the role and quality of EA as an environmental safeguard in support of sustainable development?
Okay, I think, Bridget, on that one, just having the right information and everybody using the same information would immediately improve on the quality of the environmental impact assessment in the country. And I think that was the only question that came from that.
Yes, and how will this improve the efficiency of our system of environmental regulation is the second part.
Okay, so I think we've never had the opportunity to provide a compliance statement. So always you had to, the developer had to pay for and an EAP had to do an assessment, which could take many weeks. and could be quite a lengthy document. Now, with a compliance statement, it's just a 2-pager that's signed by a qualified person. So it does really reduce the workload where the sensitivity is low. And then where the sensitivity is high, what we've also ensured, or what the protocols are to ensure, is that everybody provides the same information for decision making. So you have to answer specific questions. And each EAP needs to answer those same questions. So I can't get a document that's 50 pages thick with research and the latest up-to-date research on a fact, but actually there's no real detail of how this development will impact on the site. So you are required, an EAP will be required, or a specialist will be required to actually provide information that is needed by the decision maker.
Is it possible for DEA to consider extending the deadline for comment?
Unfortunately, it's not possible. I think that's also why the IAIA set up this webinar. The protocols have been out, will have been out for 30 days. We have some, our department is looking for efficiency, and they're not, it's not a very extensive document. So we believe that the time period was actually provided, which is sufficient. There has also been presentations at the Biodiversity Forum last year where these protocols have been discussed. So we do think that there has been quite some time given to actually providing information.
All right. Mining has been listed on one of the themes. Will it be required to complete this screening tool in the future for mining?
The screening tool is used for all applications, for all environmental assessment applications. And currently, well, since 2014, mining uses the EA requirement. So a screening tool and a screening report will be required for a mining application.
A comment that the tool is not totally stable on, for example, Firefox or Internet Explorer, but seems to work fine on Chrome. Will this tool be made more compatible on different browsers?
We were not aware that they were unstable on other browsers, but if it is working perfectly on Chrome, I think Chrome is a downloadable web browser. And I think for EAPs who need to use the screening tool as part of the requirements, would need to make sure that they use the system that is most stable then.
If a specialist confirms low sensitivity, do we still need to run the full EIA process or not?
If the specialist confirms a low sensitivity, that's where the compliance statement kicks in, and they would have to just sign the declaration and sign the compliance statement and indicate that in their professional opinion and from the site visit that they've undertaken, it is low sensitivity and there would be no further requirement to do an assessment.
Is there an opportunity to motivate to be exempted from the requirements for detailed assessments where the site is obviously transformed or degraded?
I think, Bridget, that was dealt with in the site verification. If you get onto site, the screening tool shows a high sensitivity. You get onto site, you see that it's transformed. You would take evidence. You would find your evidence, photographs, satellite imagery, and you would provide that to the. You would provide that in your report, and you would indicate that based on that evidence, you would be doing the compliance statement.
Will DEA also source the confirmation of the provincial authorities for compliance statements, both low or medium, as they currently do?
There is no compliance statement currently, so I'm not clear how to answer that. But each competent authority is responsible for their own decision making. They don't request, I mean, they could get comment, but the comment is not from DEA to do. It is the responsibility of the EAP to get comments from a provincial department if it was if it was going to the national competency. So but I think the question in terms of the compliance statement is not provided for currently.
Okay. Just scrolling through some more questions. There are a lot of them. So please, a lot of them, but we still have time for more. So please feel free to continue to enter your questions in the questions panel. How do the protocols identified relate to areas that are identified in SDFs for development and are already zoned as such and have been through their own public participation through the SDFs and zoning processes?
I think on that one, when you do your EIA, you have to look at strategic development frameworks from local municipalities, and that talks to your need and desirability. So that doesn't really talk to the sensitivity of the site, it just talks to the need and desirability of your development. So there would be no linking, because the protocols are really linked to the sensitivity of the environment, not the need and desirability of your project. Obviously, the need and desirability comes into your reporting, but it doesn't really form part of if you do or don't do an assessment on the site. That is purely sensitivity related.
How quickly will data on the web tool be updated in line with proof of a new sensitivity rating after a compliance statement?
Currently, there's no ability to change the national data. So SAMBI would need to change the data from time to time as information comes in. But we were discussing a grey layer for the screening tool, but at the moment it hasn't really been developed further, because the information would have to be verified through either SAMBI, the heritage specialists, the agricultural specialists. So yeah, we haven't worked out a process for that yet, but that is one of the things that the screening tool could actually produce in the future.
Will the department provide a template for the initial site verification report? And will it, if so, will it be appended to the application form? And then there's a question also about the timeframes for review and decision making. So a template for the initial site verification report and timeframes for review and decision making.
The protocols are quite clear on what needs to be in the report. It's pretty well bulleted, so there won't be a template for the site verification. They would have to just produce the information that's required in the protocol, and there would be no changes to the timeframes. It sits, the information goes into the EIA documentation that's submitted, and the timeframes remain the same.
Are compliance statements subject to public participation?
Compliance statements would go into the EIA documentation, and the EIA documentation is subjected to public participation.
There are quite a number of environmental management regulations, etc., out for comment at the moment and in recent months. Could this justify an extension of time to comment?
No, I think each one is separate. At the moment, there is only 2 environmental pieces of legislation out at the moment. The first one is the protocols, which really deal with a specific sector, which is the environmental assessment practitioners and specialists. And then it's the financial provision regulations, which really only deals with the mining sector. So it's 2 completely different sectors that are involved. Yeah, so it wouldn't look at an extension.
Who qualifies as a specialist? Is it SACNASP or SACNASP registration mandatory, and who checks that?
The protocols are clear where the SACNASP registration is required. And I think any professional who puts down that they're SACNASP registered and gives a number and they're found not to be, would be yeah, they would be acting in a non-professional manner, which is perhaps even fraudulent. So the department wouldn't be checking registration numbers. I think that would be really, you would be hoping that specialists would be professionals.
How do you interrogate the reason for the determination of the status of each category? That is, the reason for the sensitivity being found to be high, medium, or low.
The sensitivities have been based on either SAMBI data or on the strategic environmental assessments that have been done for various projects. For example, renewables, gas pipelines we're currently busy with, electricity grid infrastructure. So we've actually determined the sensitivities based on the work that had been undertaken in those documents as well.
Have provincial conservation agencies reviewed and or endorsed the biodiversity protocol?
SAMBI has consulted the biodiversity protocol, and I would imagine that the provincial biodiversity institute should make comment on the protocols before they are implemented. So we would be looking at any of their comments through the comment period as well.
Will the sensitivity ratings be updated based on specialist study findings?
No, it's unlikely because the sensitivity data wouldn't change based on site-by-site sensitivity verification. As I mentioned, that SAMBI would have to do a holistic review of sensitivities in order for the sensitivities to change.
If the tool states low sensitivity, isn't the specialist supposed to do the full assessment to determine or confirm this? Will a desktop study be adequate, or is it a must to have a site visit?
I think the protocols do require a site visit. It would be very unlikely that you would be able to confirm a low sensitivity just looking at satellite imagery. So it would be necessary to have a site visit. And I do think that that is the current practice. Yeah.
How will it be ensured that other competent authorities, including provinces and the DMR, are capacitated to understand and review the protocols that are submitted?
There aren't protocols that will be submitted. It will be normal reports. So it's just really, the protocols just guide the content of the report. So currently, the provinces are very well capacitated to review reports, and so is DMR. And now what it just means is that the reports would maybe be more streamlined, and we would be ensured to be making decisions on information which is the same if you were in the Western Cape or in the Eastern Cape, or if you were doing a mining application and you were looking at terrestrial biodiversity, or if you were doing a clearance of vegetation and looking at terrestrial biodiversity.
Will the screening information be submitted for adjudication to the relevant CA, or will DEA consider it all?
The documents still get submitted to the normal competent authority. So if it's a provincial competent authority, the document goes to the provincial competent authority with the application, if the question is around the screening report, and it would go to the national if the national competency had been identified. So there wouldn't be a change to where the documents get considered.
Will the DEA be looking to see that a SACNASP registered person is being used and rejecting any report where no registration number is provided?
It is required. The protocol makes it quite clear that the report has to contain a SAPNAS registered number. So the report would be incomplete if that SAPNAS registered number is not provided.
Can you use a SACNASP professional to write a compliance statement that is in the same company as the EAP, or is that considered to be non-independent specialist?
The protocols don't change the current requirements for independent specialists or independent environmental practitioners.
Will any training sessions be held on the screening tool in the future?
I think we've done a significant number of training sessions, and the IARA have provided, well, we did the webinar, and the webinar is basically a 2-hour training session on every aspect of the screening tool. That webinar is available on the screening tool as a YouTube, and anybody who needs any kind of assistance with the screening tool can look at the web at the YouTube, or they could phone the help desk that is also identified on the screening report tool. So we don't foresee that there would be further training. Perhaps provinces might want to do some training, but from the department side, there wouldn't be additional training.
We will, in the follow-up message that all attendees receive, we will be sure to include a link to that YouTube video so that people have quick and easy access to it again.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. If the report comes out with only the compliance statement that says, for instance, low impact, do you still need to follow the EIA process, or does a shorter process exist?
No, you need to follow the same process. It's just that you wouldn't do an assessment for that theme. So you would do the compliance statement for that theme. But the normal EIA process still applies. It's just the information that you would be submitting in that EIA report would be streamlined where you have a low sensitivity confirmed.
Do the protocols determine the terms of reference for biodiversity assessments, or must existing best practice guidelines also be applied?
I would imagine that best practice must be applied. The only thing that the protocols require is that the questions that have been identified are answered.
Okay. Should the protocols not include the requirement for specialists to make available SHP files where applicable for inclusion in national databases, as the scale of investigations might contribute to the knowledge base? The applicant would need to know about this before the project is initiated.
I think that goes to the fact that we haven't yet formalized the grey layer for the screening tool. So at the moment, there wouldn't be any way to upload that data to. So at the moment, no, that it wouldn't be necessary right now. I think we would move towards that. As specialists' information becomes available, it would be really valuable to be able to include that information on the screening tool or on the national layers, but at the moment that is not possible yet.
One gentleman is saying that from his experience, it is often not checked that a SACNASP registered specialist has been used, and authorizations have been granted in cases where non-registered persons carried out specialist studies. Should it not be legislated that the competent authority must check compliance in this regard?
I really don't think that it's up to the department to check the competencies of the professionals that are used. I think if you're a professional and you know of some fraudulent activities, you also have a duty in terms of your profession to ensure that you do the whistleblowing. I think the department might take spot checks every now and again, but it really isn't something that we would do on a regular basis to check everybody's SAPNAS registration.
In view of the national screening tool not being updated based on submitted reports, could the reports be uploaded to a database similar to SAHRA's database of heritage reports so that previous reports are accessible?
At the moment, that's not possible. I think we definitely do want to look at the future and how we would be able to document this valuable information, but at this stage we haven't got any process in place.
Can you address how up to date the data is on the screening tool?
The data on the screening tool is the most up-to-date data that is available in the country. So if you were looking for biodiversity data The data that's on the screening tool comes from Zambi. If you were looking for agricultural data, the data that's on the screening tool comes from the Department of Agriculture. And there are MOUs being signed to ensure that we get the most up-to-date data.
Could DEA call for comment on the use of the tool and protocols after, for example, 6 months of coming into effect of the regulations? That would help assist DEA in identifying practical or other difficulties.
I think on the screening tool, there's always the possibility to provide information and difficulties to the help desk. And the protocols, I'm sure if there are problems, the same as with any of the laws, we would listen to anything that is really a significant problem. And legislation does get changed from time to time. I mean, if things aren't working, yeah, so, but I don't think there would be a specific kind of 6-month comment period. The comment period is now, yeah, so there wouldn't be an additional 6-month comment period after implementation.
Is there a schedule for how often the data will be updated?
The data is updated as new data sets become available. So for example, agriculture doesn't update their data every year. They update their data when they do aerial studies, and we would get that data when they get new data coming in. Also Zambi, they don't update their data on an annual basis. So we would update the screening tool, and the screening tool has been configured in such a way that the department can actually very easily update data. So as data comes in, which is new, it will be updated.
Also related to the data, is the data set on the screening tool the same as BGIS, Zambi, or better?
It is the same as what's on, no, sorry, it could be slightly better than what's on BGIS, because they have actually looked at, we have actually looked at some of the CBAs and improved on some of the CBAs. There's also plant species data that will come onto the screening tool, which I don't think is currently on the BGIS.
If you submit a site verification with your application and motivate to low instead of high, surely you need the department to confirm they agree with your site verification before you move on with or without specialist studies in your draft BAR. This may be fine for DEADP, Western Cape, but not others, as no pre-application, there's no pre-application stage. That might be more of a comment than a question, but.
Yeah, but the application doesn't, you don't submit your site verification with your application. You submit your site verification with the documents that you submit for your environmental impact assessment. So for the application, all you have to do is submit the screening report, which is a requirement. Once it's gazetted, it will be a requirement to submit the report.
How do the screening tools and protocol consider EMFs and SDFs being up-to-date provincial local information?
Okay, the screening tool has, it does identify all the EMFs that have been gazetted. It identifies you, so if you've chosen a site and in the report, the site will identify which EMF applies. So if there is an EMF that's been adopted in the area that you're looking at, it will be identified and you will have a link to that EMF. So you would be easily able to get to the latest version of that EMF.
In terms of the screening tool, is it possible to streamline the tool more so as not to generate individual reports for all aspects of a development? For example, pipeline report, clearance of indigenous vegetation report, works within a watercourse report, infrastructure report. If I'm working on a new farming development, 6 reports might be generated and protocols applied.
There's only one screening report prepared. It could have different themes. So for example, a wind energy application, it would have a flicker theme. There wouldn't be a flicker theme for any other kind of application. So there aren't multiple reports prepared. there could be 2 reports prepared for so one could be a site report and the other one would be a development footprint report. The development footprint report is the one that's required to be submitted. The site report you would just do to help you to choose the site. So there's only 1 report. I think that answers the first part of the question. And then the protocols apply to the themes that are actually triggered by that assessment. So for example, as I mentioned, if you have a Flickr theme, you would have to do a report on Flickr. If you didn't have a Flickr theme, you wouldn't do such a report.
Will there be a bigger push from DEA's side for the Department of Agriculture and SANBI to update the data more regularly?
I don't think the department has got any mandate to require other departments to update their data. I think they update their data as they do the work and do verification. So obviously everybody would like to have updated data, and I think as the screening tool, as people see the value of the screening tool, I think data will actually be updated on a much more regular basis, but that's just a personal opinion.
Can a company use the tool to do early screening before an EAP is appointed?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the benefits of the screening tool. Anybody can get onto the screening tool. You don't have to be a GIS specialist. You can actually do I think a developer can get onto the screening tool and already assess on a desktop basis various sites, and they would have a good sense of what they would be in for in terms of specialist reports and so on before they actually appointed an EAP.
Just a clarification on an earlier point you had made. If a specialist confirms low sensitivity, do we still need to run the full EIA process or not?
Yes, the EIA process is about need and desirability. It's about a number of themes that would be triggered by your application. So for example, you could maybe have a low for agriculture, but you would still have a high for biodiversity. So an EIA is required. A protocol merely identifies the information that's required in an assessment, and a compliance statement would be there if it was low, but you would still need to do the EIA and you would still need to go through a public participation process. It just helps with the specialist work.
As you had indicated, Dee, you submit the site verification and studies, compliance statements, etc., with the draft and the final BAR. What happens if the department disagrees with the site verification at draft BAR stage and wants the full impact assessment? Timeframes are a big concern here, as one needs to understand what studies are required upfront.
I think it's really the responsibility of the specialists and the EAP to make sure that the evidence that they've provided would be compelling evidence in order for them not to have to actually go and do a specialist assessment halfway through the process.
Obtaining comment from CAA and Department of Defense can take a fair amount of time. However, their input can be critical to a project. Has the department initiated discussions with these departments to ensure a speedy response to EAPs?
I think I've answered this one before. We have been in contact with civil aviation and we have been in contact with defense. So yes, we have been in consultation with them, and the people who need to be contacted have been identified in the protocols.
The registration of the EAP is SACNASP at what level, or EAP ASA? Any other registration authorities considered or qualifications required?
I think as far as I'm aware, there's only one registration body for environmental assessment practitioners that's been approved by the minister. I'm not aware of any others. Of course, that's for general environmental impact assessment practitioners, but then there is the SAPNAS and probably engineering and a whole lot of other professionals in terms of the specialist reports.
Do you think the assessment protocols will be able to focus the assessments as intended?
Certainly, I think so, and that's why we've put this work towards preparing the protocols, and that is the objective. So hopefully we can achieve that objective.
Someone asks, why can't we have the EMP instead and not submit anything to the department? Hence, we will have the statements that confirm low sensitivity.
In any environmental authorization, the competent authority needs to make a decision. So a document must be submitted. I'm not sure that I really did understand the question, but it was sounding that if it's low sensitivity, you don't need to do an EIA. That's not the case at all. It might be low for one, as I've mentioned before, theme, but it might be high for another. And there's also public participation that has to be done. So all of that needs to be put into a document that gets considered by the department, and then decisions get made. Sorry, not only by the department, but by competent authorities.
Someone is asking if we could walk through an example now using the tool, or is that something that's shown in the YouTube video from before?
This was really about the protocols. The screening tool, if somebody wanted to go through the screening tool, it would be really advisable for them to watch the webinar on the screening tool, and then at the same time to just go onto the website and to use the tool with the guidance that's provided in the webinar. I think every step in the process of screening is very detailed. It's shown in a lot of detail in the webinar. I think it was 2 hours for the demonstration, and it really was comprehensive in terms of what was available in the screening tool and how to use everything. And also then just practice. The more you get confident with using the tool, remember you can go out of the tool at any time. You can't break anything. It's not your activities are not being monitored by anybody. So really it's there for you to use and just to play with and see how you're feeling with that, and to use it with the webinar. You would really become expert in no time at all.
EMFs and SDFs combine many attributes into zones and combine data. How are these combined interests catered for in the screening tool, which seems to be based on baseline information rather than combined information?
SDFs and EMFs, they serve a different purpose to an impact assessment. And the purpose that they serve, because you've got free access to those EMFs, if you are in an EMF area, it would really assist you with your need and desirability, because the EMFs and the SDFs identify where local municipalities would like to have certain developments. So it really talks to need and desirability. It doesn't talk to the environmental sensitivity of your terrestrial biodiversity for your site. Although it might look at terrestrial biodiversity in zoning certain activities, it's more about need and desirability rather than site sensitivity.
How long is the approval process of the compliance statement from DEA? Will this also be legislated?
There isn't a specific approval process for a compliance statement. The compliance statement is part of your EIA. So it's just part of the information that gets submitted as your EIA. So the timeframes for authorization are the same as the timeframe for the EIA. It's just a report that goes into the EIA document.
Is there a better and more recent map available elsewhere for a particular theme? Do we still have to use the spatial data hosted by the screening tool?
There is no better data than what is currently on the screening tool. All the data, the best data has been put together into the screening tool. So there is really no better data than that. There could be instances where provinces have more detailed data, and the screening tool does allow you to upload that data as part of your site verification, as part of your motivation. So all of that's available to you, but generally the screening tool would have the best data that's available currently. Nationally, it would have that data.
How does the screening tool take into consideration historical illegal activities that may have taken place on a site?
The screening tool doesn't take into consideration any historical, it doesn't take into consideration any footprints that are there. You would need to look at your Google Maps in order to identify what activities are currently there. And the screening tool is not a compliance tool. It's really a tool about flagging environmental sensitivity.
Would the screening report be attached as an appendix to the application form or BAR scoping or EIA report?
Yes, it would be attached to your report. Yeah. Sorry, not your report, your application form.
If all themes are low, can't one apply for exemption from following a BA or EIA process? Public participation forms part of the exemption process.
To get exempted from public participation is it's a very well you wouldn't get exempted from public participation, but you wouldn't need to be exempted, because if all themes are low and you've done your public participation, then that is what you need to do for that site. So that is the extent of your process. So it would be a very quick process then.
Will the use of the protocols save the environmental practitioner time in preparing the reports?
It is absolutely intended to do so, because you need to ensure that you've answered the questions that are required of you. So you wouldn't be, the whole intention is to actually reduce the size of documents to just what is actually required in order for us to make decisions.
This question goes back to something you must have said earlier. Isn't a form of regulatory impact assessment a good idea in the circumstances?
I think that both the screening tool and the protocols are there to ensure that the costs are reduced and the time is reduced. So in terms of being a good idea, I think it wouldn't really produce much. No, I wouldn't think it's necessary.
All right, this is a pretty specific question, so you may or may not be able to answer it. Why is an area within 5 kilometers of a 132 kV power line considered medium sensitive for avifauna? Surely this is highly dependent on the species that occur in the area.
Okay, I think if you look at the protocol for avian species, it very clearly identifies that the information on the screening tool is a guide. So whatever you had to do for electricity before, you would still have to do for an electricity power line, you would still have to do. So the protocol is only identified for wind activities up at this point. And there you have to do your full 12-month study. So there's no change to that. The information on the screening tool cannot be relied on. It is not, it's not complete information. And therefore there's no there's no ability to do a compliance statement for an avifaunal study. But in terms of electricity power line, you would do the same study as you currently do. You would just verify the site. So there's no change to how you would currently do electricity power line in relation to avifauna.
We have someone asking for clarification on an earlier point. If all screening tool results are low, does one need to appoint specialists?
I think it would depend on if a specialist needed to tell you that that was low. So, for example, on an agricultural theme, I don't think that a general environmental practitioner would be able to identify that your agriculture potential is low. So in certain cases, perhaps an environmental practitioner would be able to do the compliance statement, but not in all cases. And I think the protocol identifies where you would need a specialist and where an environmental practitioner is okay.
Does the protocol guide you how to do the assessment for each category of low and very high?
Yes, it does. They're not all the same. So, for example, I've mentioned avifauna for wind turbines. There, it doesn't matter if you very high, medium, or low identified. You have to do the same assessment. But in others, like terrestrial biodiversity, you have just the in and the out situation. Yeah, so it is different depending on what protocol you're looking at, but the protocols are quite clear on what it is that you need to do for each sensitivity assessment.
How is the screening tool time and cost savings on the applicant if the impacts come out as low, but you still need to appoint a specialist to confirm this and do the EIA?
I think we've answered both of those questions. You always need to do the EIA, and if you appoint a specialist or not would depend on the theme that you're looking at, and if a generalist would be able to tell you confirm that that is a low sensitivity, or if you would need a specialist in order to do that.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Does the protocol deal with all the necessary information? And if not, what would be added?
I think that's really what we are asking the EAPs and specialists to look at during this period of comment, and to make sure that we've got the best protocols that we can have, which are the most environmentally protective, while streamlining the situation and not requiring additional work where additional work is not required based on sensitivity of the site.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dee, for your presentation and answering all of the questions that were thrown at you today. Thank you to our participants for being involved and providing the questions and feedback to DEA and participating in this webinar. In a day or two, you will receive a link to the recording for this webinar. And in that follow-up message, you will also receive a link. We will include the link to the previous webinar that we did that Dee referenced that was basically a demonstration of the tool. There will also be a brief survey when you exit the webinar, and I encourage you all to complete that survey. It's very short. It has two functions. One, it helps IAIA improve its webinars, but also there are some questions specific to DEA and these protocols, and so it will provide some feedback to DEA as well. So again, thank you to our presenter, Dee, and to all of you for your time today. We know your time is valuable, and we hope that you found this to be valuable as well. Have a great day.